The call from heaven. It began as so many great tragedies do, with faith. Not greed, not conquest, at least not at first, but a promise. A promise made under candlelight and incense, beneath the vaulted ceilings of cathedrals that smelled of old stone and sanctity. A promise whispered in Latin, carried by the wind across kingdoms, mountains, and seas. Deus vult. God wills it. The year was 1095. Europe was restless. The harvests had been cruel, the winters unkind. Lords and peasants alike wandered through a landscape that felt both holy and haunted, a world that prayed as hard as it sinned. And in that twilight of faith and fear, a voice rose from the heart of Christendom, the voice of Pope Urban II. He stood before the crowd at Clermont in southern France. They say there were tens of thousands gathered there, knights, monks, peasants, widows, beggars, and thieves, all of them watching a man whose words would reshape the world. Urban spoke not of wealth, not of conquest, but of promise. A promise made under candlelight and incense, beneath the vaulted ceilings of cathedrals that smelled of old stone and sanctity. A promise whispered in Latin, carried by the wind across kingdoms, mountains, and seas. Deus vult. God wills it. But before we march east with them, before the swords are drawn and the cities burn, we should pause, because history is never as simple as it seems from the pulpit. The Crusades were not born in a single sermon. They were centuries in the making, the tangled offspring of politics, faith, greed, and fear. To understand why Europe suddenly exploded in holy fervor, we must first wander back to a world divided between the cross and the crescent.
The world before the Crusades. Imagine, for a moment, the map of the world in the 11th century. The Byzantine Empire, old, weary, but still majestic, stretched from the golden domes of Constantinople to the dusty frontiers of Anatolia. To the south and east, the Islamic world bloomed, powerful caliphates and sultanates stretching across North Africa, Egypt, and Persia. These were civilizations of science, art, and architecture, cities that glowed with libraries and bazaars, while much of Western Europe still stumbled through its so-called Dark Age. In the far west, the kingdoms of Christendom, France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, were fragmented, feudal, and perpetually bickering. Lords fought lords, kings fought popes, and peasants fought for food. Religion offered both comfort and control. Heaven was the only place promised to be better than this one, and that promise mattered deeply to those who owned nothing but their faith. Yet the Muslim world was not unified either. The great Abbasid Caliphate had fractured, and new powers had risen in its place. Among them, the Seljuk Turks, fierce nomadic warriors from Central Asia who had carved out their own empire in the Middle East. The Seljuks were devout Muslims, but their expansion alarmed both the Byzantine Empire and the Christian world. When they captured Jerusalem in 1071, it wasn't the first time the city had changed hands, but it struck a nerve. For Christian Europe, the Holy Land was no longer just far away, it was lost. And when the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sent word to the West, begging for help against the Turks, it set in motion one of the most improbable and devastating collaborations in history.
Faith meets politics. Now, don't let the word holy fool you. The Crusades were as much about power as they were about piety. The papacy, at the time, was clawing its way back from a century of corruption and chaos. The church needed a unifying mission, something to rally the faithful, silence its critics, and maybe, just maybe, extend its influence eastward. Europe, meanwhile, was brimming with restless knights, men bred for war, raised in blood and boredom. Their swords idled between feudal squabbles. Sending them east was a clever solution. It cleansed Europe of its troublemakers and turned chaos into crusade. Urban II promised them something no king could: forgiveness of sins, eternal salvation. fight for God, and every drop of blood spilled would be washed clean. It was the perfect storm: faith, fear, and opportunity, and it spread like wildfire. Within months, messengers carried Urban's call across Europe. In village squares and castle halls, preachers repeated his words with even more fire, sometimes exaggerating them beyond recognition. They promised riches in the east, adventure, even land, things most peasants could only dream of. Men and women sewed crosses onto their tunics. Entire families sold their farms to buy a sword and a mule. It was a pilgrimage, they said, a sacred journey. But behind the hymns and prayers lay a darker hunger, one that would soon devour entire cities.
A march of faith and famine. The first to answer the call were not knights or nobles, but ordinary people, farmers, beggars, monks, and zealots. They called it the People's Crusade, led by a strange preacher named Peter the Hermit, a man who rode on a donkey and claimed divine visions. Tens of thousands set off toward Jerusalem with little more than faith and food for a week. They marched across Europe, through Germany and Hungary, leaving behind a trail of chaos. Some saw every non-Christian as an enemy of God. Jewish communities along the Rhine were massacred. The first blood of the Crusades spilled not in the Holy Land, but in Europe itself. By the time the People's Crusade reached Byzantine territory, it was more of a starving mob than an army. Emperor Alexios, horrified, ferried them across the Bosporus just to get rid of them. And there, in Anatolia, the Seljuk Turks awaited. The Crusaders were annihilated. Thousands died in the dust, their dreams of holy glory reduced to bones beneath the sun. But their deaths only made the legends stronger. For those still in Europe, it became a story of martyrdom, of heroes dying for Christ. And soon, the real armies began to march. Knights from France, Germany, Italy, and England, banners of every color fluttering under the same cross. Princes and paupers, bound together by faith and ambition, converging on Constantinople. The First Crusade had begun, and the world would never be the same again. They believed they were marching for heaven, but heaven, as they would soon learn, has a strange sense of humor.
The First Crusade, Blood and Glory. When the Crusaders finally reached the Byzantine Empire in 1096, they came not as disciplined warriors of Christ, but as a tide, a living storm of chainmail, banners, and body odor. They had traveled across Europe for months, through rain and hunger, through bandit raids and betrayal, all in the name of faith. But now, standing before the shining city of Constantinople, they were confronted not with holiness, but with awe. Imagine it. After the muddy streets and wooden huts of Western Europe, the Crusaders beheld a city of marble domes and gilded mosaics, its skyline glittering over the Bosporus. Constantinople, the last great remnant of Rome. A city where gold was as common as gossip, and where even beggars wore better shoes than most European knights. The Crusaders had come to aid the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I Komnenos, but to the emperor, they looked more like a threat than an ally. Tens of thousands of armed foreigners at your doorstep chanting about holy war, it's not exactly comforting. Alexius had asked for help, but he hadn't imagined this. The alliance of uneasy faith. The emperor was a seasoned politician, sharp as a sword wrapped in silk. He welcomed the Crusader leaders one by one, dazzling them with hospitality, and then, ever so politely, demanded oaths of loyalty. Each Western prince had to swear that any lands they conquered, once part of the Byzantine Empire, would be returned to him. A reasonable request, in theory,
But these were men like Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, and Godfrey of Bouillon, proud, ambitious lords who didn't cross half the world just to hand over their prizes. They nodded, smiled, and swore their oaths before the emperor's golden throne, and deep inside they crossed their fingers. Because of course they did. Thus began one of the strangest partnerships in history, East and West united not by trust, but by necessity. The Byzantines would guide the Crusaders across Anatolia, the Turks would try to kill them, and the Pope would watch from afar, waiting for the results like someone betting on a particularly violent horse race.
Marching through hell. In the spring of 1097, the First Crusade marched into Anatolia. The sun was merciless, the land dry and treacherous. Many of these knights had never seen a desert before. They melted inside their armor, horses collapsed from thirst, and food rotted in the heat. The Seljuk Turks, led by Kilij Arslan, watched from the hills. They preferred ambushes over open battles, swift attacks with horse archers that struck like lightning and vanished into the dust. The Crusaders, weighed down by heavy armor and faith, struggled to fight an enemy that refused to stand still. But despite the chaos, they managed to win. First at Nicaea, where Alexios cleverly negotiated the city's surrender before the Crusaders could loot it, and then at Dorylaeum, where the Christian army, ambushed and surrounded, fought with desperate fury until reinforcements arrived. It was brutal, exhausting, and strangely euphoric. For many Crusaders, this was proof that God was on their side. Every victory felt divine, every death sanctified. They didn't just believe they were doing God's will, they knew it, and that certainty would only grow sharper with every drop of blood spilled. Starvation and shadows. By the time they reached Antioch in 1097, the Crusaders were ghosts of themselves. Sunburnt, starving, their numbers cut in half. Yet they stood before one of the greatest fortified cities in the Middle East, surrounded by towering walls and guarded by tens of thousands of soldiers. To siege Antioch was madness, so naturally, they did it anyway. For 8 months, the Crusaders camped outside the city, building siege towers and digging trenches, while hunger gnawed at their faith. Horses were eaten, leather boiled for soup, and rumors spread that even worse things happened in the dark of night. The lines between holy war and survival blurred. Winter came. Rain turned the camp to mud. Many deserted. Many died. And then, something strange happened. The Byzantines didn't come to help. Alexios, hearing rumors that the Crusaders were doomed, turned his army around. The Crusaders felt betrayed, abandoned by the very emperor they had sworn to serve. In their minds, one oath had already been broken. But fate, or perhaps fanaticism, kept them alive. Through a mixture of cunning and treachery, they managed to enter Antioch when one of the city's guards betrayed his post. The Crusaders stormed the gates, slaughtering as they went. Christians, Muslims, Armenians, anyone in the wrong place at the wrong time. The city was theirs. For a simple day they celebrated. Then they realized they were trapped because, in a twist that could make even the most patient saint sigh, a massive Turkish army under Kerbogah of Mosul arrived to besiege them. The besiegers had become the besieged.
Visions, relics, and madness. Desperation does strange things to men. As the Crusaders starved inside Antioch, faith turned feverish. Visions spread through the camp, tales of angels, miracles, and relics that could save them. One man claimed to have discovered the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced Christ's side. He said it was buried beneath the church floor. When they dug, they found an old iron spearhead. Coincidence? Miracle? Or a very convenient piece of theater? No one cared. The army believed again. They lifted the lance high, chanted hymns, and marched out of the city to face Kerbogah's army, a force 3 times their size. And somehow, they won. Whether by divine will, disunity among their enemies, or sheer madness, the Crusaders broke the siege. Antioch was theirs. The path to Jerusalem was open. But victory had its price. Tens of thousands had died. The city was in ruins, and already the seeds of betrayal had been sown. Bohemond of Taranto refused to hand Antioch over to the Byzantines, claiming it as his own. His oath to Alexios, forgotten. One by one, the Crusader leaders began to see not God's kingdom, but their own. Marching south, toward the Holy City. In the summer of 1099, after years of hardship, starvation, and slaughter, what remained of the crusading army finally marched south, toward Jerusalem. They were no longer knights in shining armor. They were hollow-eyed survivors, bound by blood and guilt and glory. Every step across that burning land was a prayer and a curse. Behind them lay a trail of ashes. Ahead, the city of God, gleaming on the horizon like a promise or a mirage. They had crossed half the world for faith and found something darker waiting within themselves. But they still believed the end would make it holy. And soon they would reach Jerusalem, the city of light and shadow, salvation and sin.
The siege of Jerusalem, blood upon holy ground. It was the summer of 1099. The Crusaders had been walking for 3 years, through snow, through deserts, through hunger and plague. Of the hundreds of thousands who had set out, only a fraction remained. And before them, shimmering in the heat like something half real, half divine, stood Jerusalem, the city that had haunted their prayers, their dreams, and their nightmares. The city of David, the city of Christ, the city of God. The Crusaders fell to their knees when they saw it. Some wept, some sang, some simply stared, too hollow to feel anything at all. For generations, pilgrims had walked to this city seeking salvation. Now an army had come, carrying swords, relics, and the unshakable belief that what they were about to do was righteous. It's strange, isn't it? How faith, when sharpened just enough, begins to look exactly like madness. The walls of the holy city. Jerusalem, at that time, was held by the Fatimid Caliphate, Muslim rulers from Egypt, who had only recently taken the city back from the Seljuk Turks. Its defenses were formidable, tall walls, strong gates, and well-supplied soldiers. The Crusaders, on the other hand, were exhausted, dehydrated, and hopelessly outnumbered. But they had come too far to turn back. They had been promised heaven, and Jerusalem was the closest thing on earth. They set up camp around the city, their tents like a ring of desperation in the dust. Water was scarce, food even scarcer. Some nights drank horse blood to survive. Others stared up at the walls and prayed for a miracle. That miracle came, or at least they convinced themselves it did. Supplies arrived from the coast, timber, tools, nails, enough to build siege towers, massive, creaking beasts that would crawl toward the city walls. They worked day and night under the scorching sun, chanting psalms and hammering iron. Priests walked among them preaching that every strike of the hammer was a prayer, every nail driven a step closer to salvation. Some believed the angels themselves guided their hands. By early July, the towers were ready. And so, on the morning of July 14th, 1099, the Crusaders began their final assault on the Holy City.
The day the heavens went silent, the siege began with trumpets, a sound that split the still air like a blade. Arrows rained from both sides. The towers rolled forward, creaking on scorched earth, while defenders hurled stones, boiling oil and fire. The air was thick with smoke, screams, and prayer. Knights shouted the names of saints as they climbed ladders slick with blood. On the ramparts, defenders fought with the desperation of those who knew what would happen if they failed. By noon, one of the towers reached the northern wall. A single banner rose above it,
the cross of Christ. Moments later, the first Crusaders breached the city. What followed was not holy. It was not glorious. It was not even human. They poured through the streets like a tide unbound. For 2 days, Jerusalem became a vision of the apocalypse. Men, women, and children were cut down without mercy. Blood pooled in the alleys, ran down the steps of holy shrines, and soaked the very stones they had crossed the world to reclaim. One chronicler, a Crusader himself, wrote, "In the temple and the portico of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins." And he meant it proudly, as proof that God had granted them victory. They had come to cleanse the Holy Land. Instead, they baptized it in blood. And when the killing was done, when Jerusalem lay silent beneath the summer sun, the survivors gathered at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the very place where they believed Christ had risen from the dead. There they fell to their knees, weeping and singing hymns, their armor still wet with the lives they'd taken. They thanked God for delivering his city, because of course they did. A kingdom of bones and oaths. When the slaughter ended, the Crusaders crowned their champion. Godfrey of Bouillon, the noble knight from Lorraine, refused to call himself king. He said humbly, "I will not wear a crown of gold where my savior wore a crown of thorns." A touching sentiment, though it must be said his brother Baldwin wore the crown soon enough. Thus was born the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a fragile realm of faith and contradiction, built on prayer, sustained by blood, and surrounded by enemies on every side. It was a kingdom destined to shimmer brightly and burn quickly. For the people of Europe, the victory at Jerusalem was the proof of divine favor. Pilgrims sang of it, priests preached it, and poets immortalized it. They called it a miracle, the triumph of Christendom over the infidel. But in the East, it was remembered differently. For Muslims, it was not just defeat, it was desecration. The loss of Jerusalem ignited a fury that would not sleep for long. And soon, from the deserts and cities of the Islamic world, a new voice would rise, one that would turn faith against faith once more. The Crusaders had captured the holy city. They believed the story was over. But history has never been so merciful.
The Crescent strikes back. The rise of Saladin and the Second Crusade. After Jerusalem fell in 1099, the Crusaders believed they had won the world. But victory, like sand, slips easily through the fingers. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was a fragile miracle, a tiny Christian island surrounded by an ocean of disbelief. Its lords ruled holy cities but fought unholy wars against hunger, disease, and their own arrogance. They built castles, great stone fortresses that rose from the desert like teeth. They carved out territories in Edessa, Tripoli, and Antioch. They made treaties, broke them, and made new ones again. And for a few decades, it almost seemed like they might keep what they had taken. Almost. The echo of revenge. In the Muslim world, the fall of Jerusalem had been a wound to the soul. For the people of Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo, it was not just the loss of land, it was a cosmic humiliation. The city that had once welcomed the prophet's followers was now held by those who prayed to another god. And so began a slow, patient movement, a gathering of men and ideas, of faith and fury, to take it back. But here's the thing, the Islamic world at that time was no more united than Europe. Different dynasties, rival sultans, and proud emirs ruled over fractured territories. The Seljuks, the Fatimids, and countless smaller lords all eyed each other with suspicion. If Jerusalem was ever to be reclaimed, they would need someone capable of turning chaos into unity, a man of both sword and soul. And that man would soon be born. Enter Saladin. In 1137, in the ancient city of Tikrit, yes, the same city that centuries later would give the world another infamous ruler, a boy was born to a Kurdish family. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, though history would remember him by another, Salah ad-Din, Saladin, the righteous of the faith. He did not seem destined for greatness. He was quiet, thoughtful, more interested in scholars than swords. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Under his uncle, the fierce General Shirkuh, Saladin learned the art of war, not just how to fight, but how to lead, how to inspire loyalty, how to make war seem noble. When the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt began to crumble, Saladin's uncle led an army south, and the young Saladin followed, barely 30 years old. By 1169, through a series of brilliant maneuvers, betrayals, and almost poetic timing, Saladin emerged as the new ruler of Egypt. Within a few years, he had united it under Sunni Islam and declared allegiance to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. And from there, he turned his gaze north, toward Syria, toward Jerusalem, toward destiny.
Meanwhile, in the Kingdom of Heaven, back in Jerusalem, the Christian lords were doing what they did best, arguing. The once glorious Crusader state had become a web of rivalries. The nobles of Jerusalem quarreled with Antioch, Antioch feuded with Tripoli, the Knights of the Temple in the hospital, supposedly holy orders, bickered like jealous siblings. And all the while, the Muslim forces around them grew stronger, united not by land or wealth, but by something far more powerful, vengeance sanctified by faith. In 1144, the first crack appeared. The city of Edessa, the oldest of the Crusader states, fell to Muslim forces under Imad ad-Din Zengi, a fierce ruler and, ironically, one of Saladin's early inspirations. When word reached Europe, it sent shockwaves through Christendom. The miracle of Jerusalem suddenly seemed mortal. The Second Crusade. Pope Eugene III called for another crusade, the Second Crusade. This time led not by nobles, but by kings themselves. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany took up the cross, promising to restore what had been lost. It was meant to be glorious. It became a disaster. They marched east with massive armies, but pride and poor planning proved fatal. The Byzantines distrusted them. The Turks ambushed them. And by the time they reached the Holy Land, they were broken, starving, and demoralized. Their grand campaign against Damascus, yes, the very city that had once supported them, failed miserably. The Crusaders limped home, leaving behind only corpses, confusion, and an unshakable sense of divine silence. For the Christians, the Second Crusade was proof that, perhaps, God had stopped listening. The rise of the Sultan. In the years that followed, Saladin continued to rise. He consolidated Egypt and Syria, outmaneuvered his rivals, and became the most powerful Muslim ruler in the region. But he was not a butcher, not a fanatic. He was something far rarer, a man who believed that mercy could be a weapon sharper than any sword. He built schools, hospitals, and mosques. He studied philosophy and theology, and yet when the time came to fight, he fought with relentless precision. In 1183, he stood at the gates of Aleppo, master of a united front stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. A single banner now flew where once a dozen had fluttered. The crescent had risen again, steady, patient, unstoppable. And in Jerusalem, far from this gathering storm, the Christian kingdom slept in its own illusions of peace. Its kings grew decadent, its knights proud. They held grand feasts in halls built on bones and prayed to the same God that Saladin prayed to for victory. Neither side yet knew that soon, on a field of dust and fire, one of the most legendary battles in medieval history would decide the fate of the Holy Land. Faith had drawn the first Crusaders east, and faith would soon bring them to ruin. But from that ruin, one man would rise who could make even his enemies admire him. Saladin was coming, and the Holy Land would once again be bathed in both blood and grace.
The Lion and the Sultan, the Third Crusade. By the late 12th century, the dream of Christian Jerusalem had begun to fade. The Holy Kingdom that once glittered under the cross had become a shadow of itself, divided by greed, weakened by politics, and surrounded by enemies whose patience was running out. And then came Hattin. The battle
of Hattin, 1187. It was July 4th, 1187, though this Independence Day would belong to no one. The Christian army of Jerusalem marched under the blazing sun toward the small village of Hattin, near the Sea of Galilee. At their head rode Guy de Lusignan, the king of Jerusalem, a man crowned more by accident than merit, and Reynald de Chatillon, a lord with more ambition than sanity. They believed they were marching to glory. They were marching into a trap. Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had chosen his ground carefully. He allowed the Crusaders to bake under the desert sun, their throats dry, their armor searing hot. Then he surrounded them. Archers raining arrows, drums pounding, smoke filling the air. By midday, the Crusader army was collapsing. Knights staggered and fell. Horses screamed. The relic of the true cross, carried into battle as a divine shield, was captured. By sunset, the kingdom of Jerusalem, the jewel of the Crusader dream, was gone. Saladin took King Guy captive. Reynald, the one who had broken treaties and slaughtered caravans, was brought before him. Saladin offered him water, a gesture of respect. Then, when Reynald drank, Saladin reminded him that he had not offered that drink in mercy. And in a single motion, the Sultan drew his sword and struck off Reynald's head. The message was clear: mercy for the faithful, justice for the faithless. Within months, Jerusalem fell. This time, there was no massacre, no bloodbath. Saladin's soldiers entered the holy city peacefully. He ordered that Christian holy sites be respected. He even allowed pilgrims to visit if they paid a small tax. It was in many ways a victory of the spirit, and it stunned Europe. The shock of the West. When news of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe, it hit like thunder. The holy city, lost again? It felt like betrayal, divine punishment, apocalypse. Pope Urban III reportedly died of grief upon hearing it. His successor wasted no time. Trumpets of faith once again sounded through Europe. And this time it was the kings themselves who answered. 3 of the mightiest rulers of the age took up the cross. Friedrich Barbarossa, the aging emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of France, cunning and pragmatic, and Richard I of England, better known as the Lionheart. If the First Crusade had been a holy pilgrimage, and the second a tragic blunder, the third would be an epic, a clash of titans.
The road to the Holy Land. Frederick Barbarossa, proud and old, led his massive army through Anatolia, only to drown in a river before ever reaching the Holy Land, a mundane death for a legend and a grim omen for the Crusade. Philip and Richard set sail by sea. They reached the city of Acre, where the Crusader forces had been besieging Saladin's garrison for nearly 2 years. Richard, despite arriving late, immediately took charge. He reorganized the siege, brought order, and unleashed such relentless assaults that even his enemies marveled at his audacity. After months of brutal fighting, Acre fell in 1191. But the victory came at a price. Thousands of Muslim prisoners were executed, not out of necessity, but impatience. Richard feared Saladin was stalling during ransom talks, so he ordered the prisoners killed. Even in an age accustomed to cruelty, it shocked many. Saladin, calm as ever, responded not with rage, but resolve. The Clash of Kings. From Acre, the 2 armies marched south, toward Jerusalem. At Arsuf, near the coast, Saladin ambushed Richard's forces. The Sultan's troops struck like a tide, waves of horse archers and infantry harassing the Crusaders. But Richard, methodical, fearless, almost surgical, held his knights back until the perfect moment. Then, with a single command, he unleashed them. The countercharge was devastating. The Muslim lines broke. Arsuf was a Christian victory. one that restored the Crusaders' morale and Richard's legend. And yet, even in defeat, Saladin's reputation grew. He retreated in good order, rallied his forces, and continued to shadow Richard's army without being destroyed. It was a dance, two masters circling, testing, respecting.
Faith in ruins, the last Crusades. When Richard the Lionheart sailed home, he left behind not triumph, but an echo. The Holy Land, still sacred, still contested, had changed hands yet again, but the dream of a perfect Christian kingdom was dying. And though the Crusades would continue for another century and a half, their heart was already broken. The age of faith was giving way to the age of ambition. After Richard and Saladin, Saladin's death in 1193 left his empire divided among his heirs, brothers and nephews squabbling over inheritance like hungry wolves. But the Crusader states were no better. They still clung to a few coastal fortresses, Acre, Tyre, Tripoli, outposts of faith in a sea of suspicion. In Europe, kings and popes debated new crusades. The preaching continued, the crosses were stitched, the vows were sworn. But the soul of the crusade had shifted. It was no longer about Jerusalem. It was about politics, pride, and sometimes profit. The Fourth Crusade, the broken oath. Ah yes, the Fourth Crusade, the one that didn't even reach the Holy Land. Because of course it didn't. It began in 1202 under the leadership of Pope Innocent III, who dreamed of a renewed holy war to reclaim Jerusalem once and for all. The Crusaders gathered in Venice, promising to sail east. But there was one problem. They couldn't pay the Venetians for their ships. And if you've ever done business with the Venetians, you know they don't do charity. So the Doge of Venice, a shrewd old man named Enrico Dandolo, offered a deal. Help Venice capture the Christian city of Zara, he said, a rival port. Then he'd forgive the debt. And so, in one of history's more ironic moments, Crusaders sacked a Christian city under papal blessing. Pope Innocent was furious, excommunicated them, then quietly forgave them because, well, they were still useful. But things only got worse. A Byzantine prince approached the Crusaders, promising money and men if they'd help them take back their throne in Constantinople. It sounded convenient. It sounded righteous. It sounded disastrously naive. When the deal soured, the Crusaders, unpaid, hungry, and furious, decided to take the city anyway. In 1204, they stormed Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world. For 3 days, they looted, burned, and desecrated everything sacred. Churches were stripped of gold and relics, nuns were assaulted, icons were shattered. And from the high altar of Hagia Sophia, a drunk soldier mockingly danced in priestly robes. The crusade that had once sworn to defend Christendom had just destroyed its greatest jewel. They called it divine will, but in truth, it was human folly. The Fourth Crusade ended with no Jerusalem, no salvation, only ashes. Then came one of the most haunting stories of all, the Children's Crusade of 1212. Thousands of European children, stirred by preachers and rumor, believed God had chosen them to reclaim the Holy Land. They carried crosses, sang hymns, and began marching south, barefoot, starving, yet certain that the sea itself would part for them. It did not. Many perished from hunger and exhaustion. Others were sold into slavery by merchants who pretended to help them. It is one of those moments in history so tragic that it almost feels unreal. A mass dream of faith shattered on the shores of reality. And yet it tells us everything about the time. A world so desperate for redemption that even its children took up the cross.
The Fifth and Sixth Crusades, diplomacy and decline. By the early 1200s, the crusading fever was burning out. Pope after pope called for renewed campaigns, but kings were distracted by wars at home, by politics, by each other. The Fifth Crusade, 1217 to 1221, tried to conquer Egypt, thinking that if they took Cairo, the rest would fall easily. It didn't. The Nile flooded, the Crusaders were trapped, and they surrendered. The Sixth Crusade, led by Frederick II, tried a different approach. Instead of fighting, he negotiated, and surprisingly, it worked. Through a treaty with the Sultan of Egypt, Frederick regained control of Jerusalem in 1229 without a single battle. For a brief, improbable moment, Christian prayers echoed again in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But the peace was fragile, unblessed by the Pope, and deeply unpopular among zealots. By 1244, Jerusalem was lost again, this time to the Khwarezmian Turks, who left it in ruins. The city had changed hands so many times that even heaven must have lost count. The Seventh and Eighth Crusades, the last flames. The final Crusades belonged to one man, Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis. He was devout, idealistic, and entirely unprepared for the real world. In 1248, he launched the Seventh Crusade, attacking Egypt again. He was captured, ransomed, and returned home in humiliation. But he wasn't done. In 1270, now older and frail, Louis led the Eighth Crusade, not to the Holy Land, but to North Africa. He landed near Tunis, fell ill with dysentery, and died in the dust, whispering prayers for Jerusalem. His death marked the end of an era. The Crusaders had begun with visions of saints and angels. They ended with a saint dying of fever in a foreign land. The Fall of Acre, 1291. For another 20 years, the Crusader outposts along the coast struggled on, small enclaves of knights, merchants, and priests clinging to the last pieces of the Holy Land. Then came 1291. The Mamluks, fierce soldiers from Egypt, besieged Acre, the last great Crusader stronghold. For weeks, the defenders fought desperately. Crossbows sang, towers burned, the harbor filled with smoke. But it was hopeless. When the city fell, thousands were killed. The survivors fled by sea. And with that, after nearly 2 centuries, the Crusades were over. The dream of Christian Jerusalem had finally died. Epilogue: The Memory of the Cross. And yet, the story did not end there. The Crusades had changed the world in ways no one intended. They opened Europe to the East, to its spices, its science, its medicine, its philosophy. They fueled trade, curiosity, exploration. They reshaped kingdoms, toppled empires, and even gave rise to new orders, like the Templars and the Hospitallers, whose myths still whisper in our modern imagination. But they also left wounds that have never fully healed. Centuries of misunderstanding, fear, and vengeance grew from those holy wars, echoing through history, even to our own uneasy age. Some say the Crusaders fought for God. Others say they fought for glory, for gold, for guilt. But perhaps in the end, they fought for something simpler. The hope that there was still a place on earth where heaven could be found. And when that hope crumbled, what remained was us. A world still searching for meaning, still carrying our crosses, still breaking our oaths, still dreaming of holy things in a broken world.